From the very beginning, this book invites us into an unusual kind of conversation, not one of theories and lectures, but of dialogue. Imagine yourself sitting across from an older philosopher, a person who has spent a lifetime thinking about human freedom and happiness. On the other side of the table sits a younger man, restless, full of doubts, burdened by insecurities and seeking answers. Their conversation is the essence of this story. And through their dialogue, the authors challenge us to rethink almost everything we believe about life, about happiness, and about what it means to be truly free. At the heart of this teaching is the philosophy of Alfred Adler, who argued that people are not shaped solely by the traumas of their past, nor are they prisoners of fate. Instead, we are free at every moment to choose how we live, to rewrite the meaning of our experiences, and to pursue happiness in the present, regardless of what has happened before. This is already a radical departure from the way many of us think. We often believe that our unhappiness is tied to childhood pain, unfair circumstances, or the scars left by people who mistreated us. We cling to the idea that our past holds us back, as though invisible chains were binding us to the floor. But Adler's message is bold. The past exists, yes, but it is not the force that dictates our life. What matters is not what happened to us, but how we interpret those events, the story we tell ourselves, and the direction we choose going forward. That single shift in thinking is enough to open the door to an entirely different life. The philosopher in this book explains that most people misunderstand the nature of freedom. We imagine freedom as doing whatever we want, whenever we want, free of rules or consequences. But true freedom, he argues, lies in the courage to live without being bound by the judgments and expectations of others. This is where the book's title reveals its power. To live a free life, you must develop the courage to be disliked. It sounds harsh at first. Who would willingly want to be disliked? From childhood, we are trained to seek approval, from parents, from teachers, from friends, and later from bosses, partners, and society at large. We tie our worth to the opinions of others. If they like us, we feel valuable. If they criticize us, we crumble. And yet this constant need for validation is a cage. As long as our happiness depends on external approval, we will never truly be free. The philosopher tells the young man, you can either live to meet the expectations of others, or you can live true to yourself, but you cannot do both at once. To choose yourself is to risk being disliked, but it is also to claim your freedom. The young man resists this idea. Like many of us, he cannot imagine a life where others' opinions hold no weight. He fears rejection, isolation, and being misunderstood. But the philosopher presses further. To live bound by the opinions of others is to live someone else's life, not your own. Think about how often we shape our actions to avoid criticism. We hide our dreams, silence our voices, or follow paths that were never ours to begin with. In doing so, we betray ourselves, all to avoid the discomfort of being judged. But what if being disliked isn't a failure at all? What if it is evidence that you are living authentically? The more you free yourself from the approval of others, the more you can walk your path with clarity. To be liked by everyone is impossible anyway. No matter what you do, someone will disapprove. And so the question becomes, will you live for yourself or for them? Will you chase their fleeting acceptance, or will you build a life anchored in your own values? The philosopher introduces another radical idea. Happiness is not something you achieve at the end of a long struggle. It is not hidden in future success, wealth, or recognition. It is available right now, in this very moment, if only we learn to shift our perspective. He explains that all human problems are, at their root, interpersonal problems. The way we relate to others, the way we compare ourselves, the way we measure worth, all of these create suffering. When we compete with others, we create enemies. When we seek superiority, we breed insecurity. When we demand recognition, we chain our joy to something outside of us. True happiness comes when we release these burdens and live in harmony with ourselves and with others. This doesn't mean withdrawing from the world, but rather choosing to stop measuring our worth against anyone else's. It means finding purpose in contributing to the lives of others, not competing with them. This idea connects to what Adler called the task of community. Every human being has three main life tasks: friendship, work, and love. How we approach these tasks determines our happiness. If we approach them with the mindset of competition, fear, or dependency, we suffer. If we approach them with the spirit of contribution, seeking to add value rather than to take, we find meaning. The young man objects, saying that life feels like an endless competition, that society itself is built on rankings, hierarchies, and judgments. But the philosopher responds, competition is a choice, not a law of nature. You do not need to measure yourself against others. You can choose instead to focus on doing your task, fulfilling your role, and contributing in your own unique way. Happiness arises when we find joy in being useful, in belonging, and in acting from love rather than from fear. The book challenges us with a profound thought. Unhappiness is not something forced upon us. It is something we choose. Not consciously, perhaps, but through the stories we hold about ourselves. When we say, "I cannot be happy because of my past," or "I cannot succeed because of my limitations," what we are really saying is, "I choose not to try because it is safer to blame the past than to face the freedom of the present." This is a difficult truth to accept. It means that responsibility for our lives rests with us. It means that we cannot use the past as an excuse to avoid the risks of change. But at the same time, this truth is liberating. If our unhappiness is self-created, then happiness is within our reach. If we can change our story, we can change our life. The philosopher also explains the difference between freedom and selfishness. Living true to yourself does not mean ignoring others or abandoning responsibility. It does not mean cutting ties or acting recklessly. Rather, it means recognizing the boundaries of what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Adler called this the separation of tasks. There are things that are your tasks, your choices, your actions, your life, and there are things that are the tasks of others, their choices, their feelings, their judgments. The problem arises when we mix the two. When we try to control others' tasks, we breed conflict. When we let others control our tasks, we lose ourselves. Freedom means focusing only on your own tasks and letting go of the rest. For example, whether someone likes you or not is their task, not yours. Your task is to live authentically. If you live true to yourself and they disliked you, that is their choice. It does not diminish your worth. This principle alone can free us from so much unnecessary suffering. As their dialogue continues, the young man begins to see the power in these ideas, though he resists them with every breath. He has lived his whole life believing that happiness was beyond his reach, that he was shaped irreversibly by pain, that society was unfair, and that freedom was an illusion. Now he is being told that happiness is simple, that freedom is available at every moment, and that his suffering is not caused by the past, but by his current choices. This truth is uncomfortable. It strips away excuses. It demands responsibility, but it also lights a spark. If happiness is within reach, then maybe, just maybe, a different life is possible. And that thought alone begins to change everything. The first part of this book teaches us a lesson that is both challenging and liberating. To live freely, you must have the courage to be disliked. To be happy, you must stop competing, stop comparing, and stop depending on the approval of others. To heal, you must stop clinging to the past and start choosing in the present. These are not easy lessons. They go against much of what we are taught. But if you sit with them, if you let them sink in, they reveal a path to a life of true freedom. Imagine waking up tomorrow without the weight of others' opinions pressing on your chest. Imagine living a day where your choices come from your values, not from fear. Imagine giving yourself permission to let go of the past and step fully into the present. That is the beginning of happiness. That is the beginning of courage. And that invitation this book extends to every one of us.
The dialogue continues, with the philosopher challenging the young man's assumptions about what controls his life. The young man insists that people are defined by their past experiences, their trauma, and the social hierarchies they're born into. He argues that no matter how hard someone tries, if they are born into disadvantage, or if they have experienced painful events, they cannot escape the weight of those conditions. But the philosopher shakes his head, calmly explaining that while the past may influence us, it does not determine us. The meaning we assign to events matters far more than the events themselves. This is where the essence of freedom lies. Imagine two people with similar painful childhoods. One becomes trapped, using the pain as an excuse never to move forward. The other chooses to see it as fuel to live differently. The difference is not the trauma itself, but the story each person tells about it. The philosopher insists that our lives are not ruled by what happened yesterday. They are shaped by the choices we make today and the goals we set for tomorrow. The young man resists this notion, saying it is too simple, but the philosopher explains that simplicity does not mean it is untrue. The most powerful truths often sound the simplest. This idea moves into the concept of teleology, the study of purpose. While psychology often frames people as products of their past causes, Adler's theory emphasizes the goals we are moving toward. The philosopher offers an example. Imagine a person who suffers from chronic stomach aches every time they are supposed to give a public speech. Traditional thinking might say the cause is anxiety rooted in some childhood embarrassment. But in Adler's view, the stomachache serves a purpose. It allows the person to avoid giving the speech. In other words, the symptom exists not because of the past, but because it fulfills a present goal. This is shocking to the young man, who finds it almost insulting, as though the philosopher is accusing people of lying about their suffering. But the philosopher clarifies that this is not about deceit. It is about recognizing that our behaviors often protect us from things we fear, and that means we can also change them if we are willing to pursue different goals. The young man becomes frustrated. If life is truly about the goals we set, then what about those who set goals but fail? What about people who work tirelessly but still find themselves defeated? The philosopher acknowledges this reality, but explains that many people's goals are misplaced. They chase recognition, wealth, or superiority over others, mistaking those for true fulfillment. Adlerian psychology warns against the trap of vertical thinking, ranking ourselves above and below others in a hierarchy. The young man admits that this describes him well. He has always felt inferior when comparing himself to others, always measuring his worth by whether he is winning or losing. The philosopher explains that this obsession with comparison is the root of most unhappiness. Life should not be a contest. The only meaningful measure is how fully we live according to our own values, not whether we stand taller than someone else. The conversation then touches on the concept of tasks of life. According to Adler, human beings face three unavoidable tasks: work, friendship, and love. Each of these requires courage and the willingness to engage with others as equals. Work is not only about earning money, but about contributing to the community, giving something of value. Friendship is about forming bonds without dominance or inferiority, seeing others as partners rather than competitors. Love is the most difficult task because it demands complete equality and deep trust. When people avoid these tasks, whether by retreating into isolation, clinging to superiority, or fearing rejection, they stagnate. The philosopher explains that all psychological problems are, at their core, problems of interpersonal relationships. Even depression, anger, and anxiety can be traced back to the way we relate to others and the roles we imagine ourselves playing. The young man finds this confronting because it implies that happiness requires not withdrawal but connection. The dialogue sharpens around the theme of freedom. The young man argues that people are prisoners of social expectations. Parents demand success, society rewards status, and failure is punished. The philosopher responds that true freedom means the courage to be disliked. If we spend our lives trying to please everyone, we surrender our own choices. The philosopher emphasizes that freedom always carries risk. To choose your own path is to accept that others may not approve of you. But this disapproval is not fatal. It is simply the price of living authentically. The young man feels the sting of this idea. He admits that much of his life has been about winning approval, proving his worth, and avoiding the shame of rejection. The philosopher tells him that until he can release this obsession, he will never taste freedom. Freedom is not about doing whatever you like. It is about living without fear of others' opinions. As this part of their dialogue closes, the young man is both challenged and unsettled. He sees that his desire for recognition has been chaining him to unhappiness. He begins to realize that perhaps he has been living in a cage built from his own comparisons, his own fears of being disliked. The philosopher's words force him to confront a possibility he has long avoided, that the only way to truly live is to stop measuring himself against others and to begin defining himself from within. The young man is not ready to accept this fully, but a seed has been planted. He is beginning to understand that the path to happiness may not be about changing the world around him, but about changing the story he tells himself about who he is and why he lives.
The philosopher begins this part of the dialogue by introducing the concept of separation of tasks. He explains to the young man that much of human unhappiness comes from confusion about where one's responsibilities end and another's begin. When we try to live for others' approval, we are crossing into tasks that do not belong to us. For example, a student's task is to study and learn. Whether the teacher is pleased with the result is the teacher's task, not the student's. Likewise, when we choose a life path, the opinions others form of our choices belong to them, not to us. The philosopher stresses that if we spend our energy trying to control how others see us, we will never be free. The young man bristles at this idea, insisting that society demands recognition, that no one can simply ignore others' judgments. But the philosopher calmly points out that recognition is not necessary for happiness. Contribution is. When we shift our focus from pleasing others to contributing value, we find peace. The measure is not whether people applaud, but whether we are living authentically. The conversation deepens as the young man admits that his fear of rejection has stopped him from pursuing relationships. He worries constantly about what people think of him. The philosopher challenges him. Is it your task to decide how others feel about you? The young man pauses. He realizes that he has been carrying a weight that is not his to carry. The philosopher illustrates further. If you confess your feelings to someone and they reject you, the rejection is their task. Your task is only to express your truth. Once you see the boundaries clearly, life becomes simpler. You no longer waste energy trying to manipulate outcomes beyond your control. The philosopher describes this as the courage to separate tasks. It is liberating, but also frightening, because it strips away the excuses we use to avoid action. If it is not your job to control how others react, then all that remains is the courage to act authentically. The young man pushes back, asking, if we no longer care what others think, Won't we become selfish and isolated? The philosopher responds that true freedom does not mean ignoring others. It means serving them without being enslaved to their opinions. This is where Adlerian psychology introduces the idea of community feeling, the sense that we are connected to others and that our lives gain meaning through contribution. The philosopher explains that every human being has a deep need to feel they belong. But belonging does not come from bending ourselves to fit others' expectations. It comes from offering something genuine. If we seek belonging by pretending, we remain lonely. If we seek belonging by living authentically and contributing sincerely, we find true connection. The young man admits that he has always felt on the outside of relationships, as though he were never truly accepted. The philosopher tells him this is because he has been searching for belonging in the wrong place, in approval rather than contribution.
The discussion turns to love, the most difficult task of life. The philosopher explains that romantic love cannot succeed if it is built on domination, dependence, or fear of rejection. True love is only possible when two equals come together, neither trying to control the other. Many people mistake love for possession or validation, but this leads only to suffering. The young man objects, saying that no relationship can survive without compromise, without sometimes giving in to please the other. The philosopher clarifies, compromise is not the same as surrender. In healthy love, each partner chooses to contribute freely, not out of fear or obligation, but out of care. The courage to be disliked extends even into love, for only when you dare to show your authentic self, even at the risk of rejection, can love be genuine. Anything less is an arrangement, not true intimacy. The young man is visibly shaken by this. He confesses that he has always believed happiness would come once he found a partner who validated him. But the philosopher's words suggest the opposite, that unless he can stand freely as himself, no partner will ever make him happy. The philosopher affirms this truth. Happiness does not come from being loved, but from loving authentically. If you demand constant proof of love from another, it means you are still living for approval, still chained by fear of being disliked. The philosopher's calm gaze unsettles the young man because it forces him to see how deeply he has trapped himself in the search for validation. To escape, he must risk being disliked, even in the most intimate relationships. This section of the dialogue closes with a powerful image. The philosopher tells the young man to imagine life as standing on a stage. Many people live as though the audience's applause is the goal. They perform, they bend, they fear mistakes, all for the sound of clapping hands. But true freedom comes when you step off the stage altogether, when you no longer live to be watched, but live simply to live. At first, the silence of no applause feels terrifying, but soon the quiet becomes peace, and in that peace, you discover your real self. The philosopher insists that only then can you truly connect with others, not as actors performing roles, but as equals sharing life. The young man sits in silence, realizing that this may be the most frightening yet most liberating idea he has ever encountered.
The philosopher begins this part with a startling declaration. Freedom is not about escaping responsibility, but about fully embracing it. The young man had always imagined freedom as being able to do whatever he wanted without constraint, but the philosopher turns this idea upside down. True freedom, he explains, is not freedom from responsibility, but freedom to accept one's role in creating meaning. The young man is unsettled because he realizes he has been confusing indulgence with freedom. Living only for pleasure, avoiding pain, chasing approval, these are not signs of a free life, but of a life bound by fear. The philosopher insists that real freedom comes when you stop running and accept that every choice you make is yours alone. The courage to be disliked is, at its core, the courage to accept responsibility for your own happiness. The conversation shifts toward the idea of contribution. The philosopher explains that every human action can be seen through the lens of whether it contributes to others. Contribution is not always grand. Even the smallest act of kindness, a smile or the willingness to listen, can matter. What chains us, however, is the belief that our worth depends on recognition. When we free ourselves from needing recognition, we unlock the power to contribute freely without calculation. The young man resists again, arguing that people need rewards and acknowledgement to stay motivated. But the philosopher asks, if you only act for a reward, are you truly free, or are you merely a servant of praise? The young man falls silent, realizing that he has been trading his freedom for approval without ever questioning it. The philosopher then introduces the idea of living in the here and now. He explains that most people live in either the past or the future. They are weighed down by past mistakes or anxieties about what is to come. But happiness can only exist in the present. To live fully in the here and now means to stop asking whether what you do will be judged worthy in the future, and to instead focus on whether what you do now is contributing to life. The young man grows restless, admitting that he often wastes time imagining how others will view his choices years from now. The philosopher tells him bluntly, that is not living. That is acting in a play you did not write. If you want to live authentically, you must write your own script, not rehearse endlessly for an audience that may never clap.
The discussion takes a practical turn. The philosopher gives the example of work. Many people despise their jobs, believing they are meaningless or oppressive. But meaning is not found in the job itself. It is found in how you approach it. If you see work as mere survival, you will feel trapped. If you see work as contribution, even the smallest task can be dignified. The young man laughs bitterly, saying that no one wants to spend their life in a dull job. The philosopher nods but replies, the dullness is in your interpretation, not the task. If you understand how your effort connects to others' lives, the dull becomes purposeful. Contribution transforms perspective. The young man begins to understand that freedom is not about escaping situations, but about choosing how to live within them. The philosopher concludes this section with a challenge. He tells the young man that living authentically will not make life easier. On the contrary, it will often make life harder because people will dislike you for refusing to conform. But this is the price of true freedom. To live without courage is to live a borrowed life, never knowing who you really are. To live with courage is to accept the risk of rejection in exchange for the possibility of genuine connection and contribution. The philosopher's words strike deeply. The young man realizes that much of his suffering has not come from life itself, but from his unwillingness to face the fear of being disliked. For the first time, he begins to see that the fear may never go away, but courage means acting despite it.
The philosopher now shifts the discussion toward relationships, explaining that all problems in life are, in essence, problems of interpersonal relationships. This idea shocks the young man. He had imagined that many of his struggles came from his own flaws or from the harshness of society. But the philosopher insists, even those struggles are framed through how we relate to others. Loneliness, jealousy, resentment, even ambition, each of these gains its weight only in the presence of another. The young man resists, saying that surely poverty or misfortune can exist without others. The philosopher calmly replies, even poverty is defined by comparison. To be poor is only to lack something in relation to those who have more. In isolation, you would not call yourself poor. This perspective unsettles the young man, but it forces him to admit that his greatest pains have always involved other people, what they thought, what they said, what they withheld. The philosopher introduces the concept of separation of tasks. Most of our suffering, he explains, comes from confusing our tasks with the tasks of others. Each person has their own life tasks, their own responsibilities. But we constantly intrude on others' tasks, trying to control how they see us, how they act, what they think. The young man interrupts, but surely we must care what others think, otherwise society would collapse. The philosopher shakes his head. To live freely, you must separate your own task, to live authentically, from the task of others, which is to decide how they respond. If someone dislikes you, that is not your task to resolve. If you spend your life trying to control others' opinions, you will never be free. The young man grows quiet, recognizing that much of his life has been consumed by attempts to please, persuade, and manipulate others into liking him. The philosopher then raises a paradox. When you stop trying to be liked, you become more likable. People are drawn to those who act with sincerity, even if they do not agree with them. By chasing approval, you appear needy. By living authentically, you project strength. The young man scoffs, saying that surely some people will dislike you no matter what. The philosopher agrees, and that is the point. The courage to be disliked is about recognizing that universal approval is impossible and unnecessary. What matters is whether you live true to yourself and contribute meaningfully, not whether everyone applauds. The young man feels a flicker of relief, as though a great burden is being lifted. He begins to imagine what it would be like to act without constant fear of disapproval. For the first time, the idea of freedom feels possible.
The discussion turns to love and community. The philosopher explains that the highest form of contribution is found in relationships where people accept one another as equals, without domination or submission. Love is not about possession or control, but about standing side by side as fellow travelers. Community is not about blending in, but about cooperating freely without the chains of recognition. The young man admits he has never experienced such pure relationships. His connections have always been tangled with jealousy, insecurity, or the need for praise. The philosopher assures him that this is common but not inevitable. By practicing separation of tasks and focusing on contribution, one can build relationships grounded in respect rather than fear. The young man grows hopeful, imagining a life where he does not need to beg for validation, but can simply share his journey with others. As this part closes, the philosopher repeats the lesson. Freedom is not freedom from others, but freedom within relationships. The measure of a life is not how many people like you, but whether you have the courage to live authentically among them, contributing without fear of rejection. The young man is left silent, reflecting on how much of his life has been stolen by the endless pursuit of approval. The courage to be disliked is beginning to sound less like a burden and more like liberation. He feels a quiet strength rising, though he is not yet sure if he can live it. The philosopher begins this final discussion by addressing the young man's deepest fear, that without striving for approval, life might lose meaning. If he no longer works to impress, to rise above others, or to avoid being judged, then what is the point of living? The philosopher answers gently, the point of life is not to compete, but to contribute. Meaning is not discovered in the spotlight of recognition, but in the quiet act of adding value to the world around you. This is the difference between living in the pursuit of validation and living in service of life itself. The young man resists, arguing that human beings are wired to seek recognition. The philosopher acknowledges this, but warns that chasing recognition is like drinking seawater. It may temporarily quench, but it leaves you thirstier. True fulfillment comes only from contribution without condition. The philosopher then turns to happiness. He states plainly, happiness is the feeling that one is useful to others, not superior to others, not admired by others, but useful. This is a radical redefinition for the young man who has always thought happiness came from being special, from standing out, from winning the race. But the philosopher insists that true joy is found in belonging, in knowing that your presence supports others in some way. A mother comforting a child, a worker doing their job with care, a friend listening without judgment. Each of these creates happiness, not because they are rewarded, but because they contribute. The young man is stunned. All his life he has chased recognition and still felt empty. Could it be that he has been climbing the wrong mountain? The conversation then deepens into the subject of freedom and responsibility. The philosopher explains that when you choose to live authentically, you also accept responsibility for your life. You can no longer blame your past, your parents, or society for your unhappiness. To claim freedom is to claim responsibility. The young man finds this both empowering and terrifying. It means he is not trapped, but it also means he can no longer excuse his choices. The philosopher reminds him that this is the essence of courage, to step into responsibility, knowing that freedom is both a gift and a burden. The young man feels his resistance weaken. For the first time, he sees his life as something he can shape rather than something imposed on him.
The philosopher concludes with a challenge. Live as though you are dancing. Life is not a race with winners and losers, nor is it a ladder with people above and below. Life is a dance, to be enjoyed step by step, moment by moment. You do not dance to reach a finish line. You dance because dancing itself is the point. The young man smiles faintly at this image, though he insists he has never danced in his life. The philosopher replies, "Then let your living be your dance. Live with joy, not comparison. Live with courage, not fear. Live with the acceptance that some will dislike you, and in that acceptance, find true freedom." As their dialogue draws to a close, the young man is no longer the same. He has not solved every problem, nor has he shed every doubt, but a seed has been planted. The courage to be disliked is no longer an abstract phrase, but a possibility that he can feel within himself. For the first time, he sees that the life he envies in others is available to him not through approval, not through recognition, but through the quiet courage of contribution and authenticity. As he stands to leave, he feels both lighter and stronger. The philosopher watches him go, knowing that the conversation is only the beginning. The true dialogue will unfold in the young man's life, in the choices he makes each day, and in the courage he carries forward.
The story begins with a young man, restless and unsatisfied with life. He believes that happiness is always out of reach, chained by past traumas, by circumstances, and by what society expects of him. He carries with him a deep frustration that life is unfair, that people have hurt him, and that he is trapped in a world where freedom is an illusion. One evening, he meets a philosopher whose calm presence seems to radiate certainty. This philosopher proposes something shocking. You can be happy now, in this very moment, without changing your past or waiting for the future. The young man laughs bitterly. He insists that his past is a prison and that happiness is possible only after success, after recognition, after others finally see his worth. But the philosopher challenges him, saying that trauma does not dictate destiny. The past is a story we tell ourselves, but the present is always within our control. This idea unsettles the young man. He pushes back, angry at the suggestion that he can simply decide to be free. The philosopher explains that freedom is not given to us by others. It is claimed by taking responsibility for how we interpret and respond to life. The young man feels resistance rising, but curiosity holds him in the conversation. Could it really be that happiness is not something to be earned, but something to be chosen? The dialogue deepens as the philosopher explains that people often hide behind their suffering because it gives them a sense of security. If I say, "I cannot live happily because of my parents, my failures, or my scars," then I have an excuse to avoid the courage of change. But in truth, those stories are tools we use to justify our fear of freedom. The philosopher introduces the idea that life is a series of tasks, and our greatest suffering comes when we try to solve tasks that are not our own. For example, when we live for the approval of others, we are stepping into their tasks, because whether they like us or not is not something we can control. The young man bristles, insisting that human beings naturally care about reputation. But the philosopher remains firm. The root of our anxiety lies in trying to control what is outside our sphere of responsibility. If you focus only on your own tasks, your own choices, you will find peace. The young man scoffs, saying that sounds selfish, but the philosopher shakes his head. On the contrary, it is the only way to truly connect with others, because when you release the need to manipulate or please them, you allow genuine relationships to form. Slowly, the young man begins to feel the weight of his constant striving, the endless need for recognition, the exhaustion of trying to control others' opinions. For the first time, he considers what it might feel like to lay that burden down.
The philosopher then reveals a profound idea. All problems are interpersonal relationship problems. At first, this seems too simple, even absurd. But as he explains, the young man realizes the truth in it. Whether it is anxiety, anger, jealousy, or loneliness, each struggle can be traced back to how we relate to others and how we perceive our place in the social world. The philosopher distinguishes between vertical and horizontal relationships. Vertical relationships are built on hierarchy, comparison, competition. I am above you or below you, better or worse. Horizontal relationships, on the other hand, are built on equality and cooperation. I walk alongside you, neither superior nor inferior. Most of our suffering, the philosopher argues, comes from living in vertical relationships, always measuring ourselves against others, always fearing judgment. The courage to be disliked means having the strength to step into horizontal relationships, to say, I am equal to you, even if you do not like me. This is terrifying for the young man, who has spent his life climbing ladders and fearing rejection. Yet, he cannot deny the logic. If he could stop competing, if he could accept himself as equal without needing to prove superiority, perhaps the chains around his heart would finally break. The philosopher then confronts the young man with the truth about freedom. Being free means being willing to be disliked. This is the heart of courage. If you are always living for others' approval, you will never be free. True freedom comes when you are willing to disappoint, to anger, or to confuse others by living in alignment with your own values. The young man recoils at this. To be disliked feels unbearable. Doesn't everyone want to be loved, to be accepted? But the philosopher replies, if you are loved only because you conform, then you are not truly loved. You are performing for acceptance, and the real you remains unseen. To live authentically means accepting that some will disapprove, some will judge, some will walk away. The courage to be disliked is the courage to live honestly. The young man protests that this would leave him isolated, but the philosopher reminds him of horizontal relationships. When you no longer manipulate or beg for approval, the connections you keep are genuine, not conditional. A strange sense of relief washes over the young man. Perhaps he has never truly been loved because he has never truly shown himself.
The philosopher begins this final discussion by addressing the young man's deepest fear, that without striving for approval, life might lose meaning. If he no longer works to impress, to rise above others, or to avoid being judged, then what is the point of living? The philosopher answers gently. The point of life is not to compete, but to contribute. Meaning is not discovered in the spotlight of recognition, but in the quiet act of adding value to the world around you. This is the difference between living in the pursuit of validation and living in service of life itself. The young man resists, arguing that human beings are wired to seek recognition. The philosopher acknowledges this, but warns that chasing recognition is like drinking seawater. It may temporarily quench, but it leaves you thirstier. True fulfillment comes only from contribution without condition.
The philosopher then turns to happiness. He states plainly, happiness is the feeling that one is useful to others, not superior to others, not admired by others, but useful. This is a radical redefinition for the young man, who has always thought happiness came from being special, from standing out, from winning the race. But the philosopher insists that true joy is found in belonging, in knowing that your presence supports others in some way. A mother comforting a child, a worker doing their job with care, a friend listening without judgment. Each of these creates happiness, not because they are rewarded, but because they contribute. The young man is stunned. All his life he has chased recognition and still felt empty. Could it be that he has been climbing the wrong mountain? The conversation then deepens into the subject of freedom and responsibility. The philosopher explains that when you choose to live authentically, you also accept responsibility for your life. You can no longer blame your past, your parents, or society for your unhappiness. To claim freedom is to claim responsibility. The young man finds this both empowering and terrifying. It means he is not trapped, but it also means he can no longer excuse his choices. The philosopher reminds him that this is the essence of courage, to step into responsibility, knowing that freedom is both a gift and a burden. The young man feels his resistance weaken. For the first time, he sees his life as something he can shape, rather than something imposed on him. The philosopher concludes with a challenge. Live as though you are dancing. Life is not a race with winners and losers, nor is it a ladder with people above and below. Life is a dance, to be enjoyed step by step, moment by moment. You do not dance to reach a finish line. You dance because dancing itself is the point. The young man smiles faintly at this image, though he insists he has never danced in his life. The philosopher replies, "Then let your living be your dance. Live with joy, not comparison. Live with courage, not fear. Live with the acceptance that some will dislike you, and in that acceptance, find true freedom."
And so, as the conversation between the youth and the philosopher draws to a close, we are left with a quiet challenge. A challenge not of intellect, but of courage. The courage to stop hiding behind the past, to stop blaming the world, to stop arranging our lives so that we never offend or disappoint. We are asked to step into the sunlight of responsibility, to claim our right to live freely, even if the cost of freedom is the possibility of rejection. Because, in truth, to be disliked is not a punishment. It is a sign that you are living authentically, following your own path, refusing to bend yourself into the shape of someone else's expectations. The book reminds us that happiness is not something granted by society or locked away in childhood experiences. It is not an award given for compliance or perfection. Happiness is the act of choosing to live now, in this very moment, without dragging the chains of yesterday or the shadows of tomorrow. It is the decision to focus only on the tasks that are truly ours and to let others carry what is theirs. When we make this separation clear, we find that our burdens lighten, our hearts loosen, and a space opens where freedom can finally breathe. And in that space, something beautiful happens. We no longer live for the approval of others. We no longer measure our worth by likes, applause, or recognition. Instead, we find meaning in contribution, in the quiet act of adding value to another person's life without needing credit. This is community feeling, Adler's deepest insight, that life's greatest fulfillment is not dominance nor comparison, but a sense of belonging through giving. Not the belonging of dependency, but the belonging of choice, where you know you are part of humanity simply by living authentically within it. Of course, it is not easy. To stand up and be yourself, knowing that others may turn away, takes courage. To step off the stage of competition and comparison requires strength. To say, "I am enough," even if you do not approve, feels dangerous at first. But as the philosopher insists, freedom has always been dangerous, and yet it is the only path to true happiness. If we can summon this courage, the courage to be disliked, we find that the world does not end when someone frowns, rejects, or misunderstands us. Instead, life becomes simpler, lighter, more honest. So perhaps the real question is not, "Can I be happy?" but, "Am I willing to be free?" Because happiness is already here, waiting in the present, in the tasks that are yours, in the relationships you choose to nurture, in the meaning you create. The book leaves us with this invitation. Do not wait for permission. Do not search for perfect conditions. Do not expect the world to clap before you take your step. Begin now, live now, and trust that even if you are disliked, your life can still be full of purpose, joy, and connection. This was The Courage to be Disliked. You've heard its challenge, its wisdom, its call to freedom. Now let your thoughts settle, let its ideas echo softly in your mind, and carry with you the courage to live your life as your life, starting from this very moment.